Welcome, everybody. Great to see so many people coming in. I'm just going to wait for a couple of minutes to allow more people to join. One more minute, if that's okay with everybody. Great. Well, I think we should get started because it's 3 minutes past 2 in London time, and New York time, Rebecca, is 3 minutes past 9 a.m., is it? So I hope everybody has a coffee and a bagel or whatever your New York late breakfast of choice is. It's very exciting to be holding this session in New York Climate Week. One of the big advantages of a virtual event is that we can fit a lot of people in our Teams room here. So thank you to everybody for participating. I think we've got students, researchers, NGOs, some global banks, some regional banks, some development finance institutions, some businesses, some citizens, so a real range of people, just the sorts of people we were hoping to participate with us. And this is a brainstorm session about data, and particularly what we've been calling just data. So what do we mean? What do we mean there? What we mean is putting data at the service of the just transition, rather than making it a privilege for only some institutions. And so briefly, just data has some characteristics. One is that it's data that has full coverage of developing countries as well as richer nations, so it doesn't leave anybody out. The second characteristic is that it's open access, or if it's not completely open access, then at least it's easy access and available at cost without kind of huge profits going to proprietary organizations that take public data and put it in a black box and charge for it. So it's got a transparent box around it. Thirdly, we're putting tools in the hands of those that need to take the action rather than those that are observing the action from the centers of power in Washington or London or New York or Geneva. So we're trying to get tools onto the ground in countries where climate action is taking place. And fourthly, that it's multidisciplinary, so that it's bringing together information on emissions, it's bringing together information on risks, it's bringing together socioeconomic information on societal impacts and employment. And it's overlaying those so that a rich picture emerges of how climate action needs to happen and who needs to take place. So I've got a great panel of experts to join me here. My name is Alex McGilvray. I'm the Executive Director of the Joint Impact Model. I'm joined by Gerhard, who is the co-founder and director of Climate Risk Services. And we are going to be joined by Bene, who is one of the principal communication experts in the Climate Trace Coalition, and by my colleague Rebecca Sharp, who is also at the Joint Impact Model. And we're going to be talking a little bit about 3 different tools that are increasingly being put together to provide richer insights. They're pretty good tools on their own, but we all on the panel believe that if we can go the extra mile, then we can create some genuinely new insights that are really actionable for all players in the just transition. And then we are going to have a discussion about that. Please, if you have questions or ideas, put them in the chat function, and the team here will do their best to answer them. If they can't, then I will throw them to the panel. We're then going to do a deep dive into a sector and a country just to show what the tools can do in a real life situation. And the country we've chosen is Brazil. Why? Well, because it's a very interesting country. It's also the host of next year's Conference of Parties in November 2025. And we're going to look at the steel sector. Why steel sector? It's a very interesting sector. It's about 11% of global emissions. It's considered a hard to abate sector. There's lots of innovation going on there. But if you're familiar with the Science Based Targets initiative, you'll see that the steel sector globally and in Brazil aren't in the forefront of target setting and planning on net zero. And therefore, it's a sector that I think can benefit from additional accountability and transparency. So that's the sector we've chosen. We've got a bet on in the team that there'll be somebody on this call that knows an awful lot more about steel in Brazil than any of us do. If that's you, please make yourself known to us, because we want to pick your brains about this at the end of in the Q&A session at the end of the discussions and going forward. But if you do make yourself known, then I stand to lose. How much have I bet? 5,000 Brazilian reais to the rest of the panel. That there's always an expert who knows more when you have a webinar. Okay, so that's enough from me. I'm going to pass the mic first of all to Rebecca. Am I passing it to Gerhard to introduce himself or to Bene?
I believe Bene is the next speaker.
Right. Bene, over to you. Rebecca, do we have Bene? If we don't have Bene, Gerhard, it's over to you. So I'm going to suggest that we go over to Gerhard while we locate Bene. And Gerhard, if you could just briefly introduce yourself before you get started, that'll be great as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I always love it when a plan goes sideways. So Bene is missing in action, but I'm sure that we will find her before the end of this webinar. So until such time, you will have to deal with me. My name is Gerhard Mulder. I am the director and co-founder of Climate Risk Services. That is a small boutique product and advisory company. And as you may conclude from the title of the name of the company, we deal with climate risk. Our mission is to build a net zero, climate resilient, and nature positive world. And we do this through a mix of data analytics and advisory work. So, Rebecca, perhaps then we can skip the climate trace slide and then go to the slides that relate to what I'm going to be talking about, and then see if Bene is going to show up. And otherwise, Alex, you know, I'm counting on your improvisation capabilities, you know, to also potentially then talk about climate trace. So
you can definitely count on me.
Fantastic. So thanks so much, everybody. We now have 115 people on this call. It is really nice to see everybody. And I can only imagine, you know, that you were standing in line at H&H Bagels this morning on the Upper West Side and getting yourself a flat white and, you know, a New York bagel with cream cheese and salmon. I am not jealous. So what I'd like to talk about here today is the physical risk element of this whole equation of data and climate change. So perhaps you can go to slide number 10, Rebecca. And maybe I can just quickly introduce then the company. So Climate Risk Services was established about 5 years ago together with, I founded it together with Stephanie Knissos. We were connecting with each other through the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. So we were born out of Oxford University. And one of the most exciting things to date was that in June 2014, we entered into a partnership with the Joint Impact Model Foundation. And as Alex already mentioned, the goal is to bring world-class climate risk analytics at low cost to banks in emerging markets. Now, the JIM Foundation has a very deep reach in these emerging markets, very often through European development finance institutions. So what we really hope is that we're going to be able to put such tools in the hands of the right people who are then going to make better decisions around mitigation and adaptation. Now, just a few words perhaps on why also about adaptation. When we think about a just transition, we often think about mitigation, and we often think about how jobs are lost, somehow need to be compensated. But let's think about adaptation. Adaptation is perhaps a bit the stepchild when it comes to climate change, and where mitigation is the big brother who gets all the attention, the queen bee, if you want. But adaptation is a little bit of the stepchild. And also look at funding. If you look at the total universe of climate finance, adaptation is only 5% of that. We need to dramatically scale up adaptation finance. And why does that then relate to a just transition? Well, there are millions and millions of jobs at risk in climate vulnerable sectors. I'm thinking about agriculture, I'm thinking about fisheries, I'm thinking about tourism. And that is not just in the emerging markets and developing economies. 2 weeks ago, I was in Norway, for example. Norway supplies 50% of the total farmed salmon to the world. So going back to that New York bagel that you had this morning. But those salmon on your bagel this morning may be at risk. And as a result, the economic sector in Norway also may be at risk. On the next slide, what I'd like to do today is just to go into the technical details of how to do a proper climate risk assessment. Now, together with our partners, if you go to the next slide, Rebecca, we have built, right on, fantastic, a fantastic platform that we're now rolling out through the JIM. And the key thing that I want you to understand here is the best way, in fact, the only way to talk about and to think about physical climate risk is that you has two main components. You need to understand what the hazard score is in a certain location or a region. Will there be a drought in a certain place? Or are we at risk from river flood? Or is it perhaps heat stress that we should be worrying about? But then each economic activity has a different relationship with that hazard. Drought, for example, can be very impactful for agriculture, but perhaps less so for, well, let's say real estate or IT. So each of these hazards and these sensitivities need to be understood in order to have a climate risk score. So what we have done is, and that is why we employ several climate data scientists. We have scored climate hazards of 14 different hazards. And then we've calculated the sensitivity scores of all economic sectors. So we have a total view of the economy and a total view of portfolios. I will rest right there. And Alex, giving it back to you and see how you're going to manage the next 5 minutes.
Thanks, Gerhard. That is really interesting, and it's nice to see that methodology out there in kind of layperson's language that I think anyone can understand. So listen, let's have a look at the Climate Trace platform. So a lot of you will know this anyway. We unfortunately have lost Bene somewhere on the virtual New York metro system, so she may be joining in a bit. But let's have a look at the basic proposition of climate trace. So Sumi, can we go back to the climate trace slides? And luckily, I think I'm familiar enough with Climate Trace. So Climate Trace, a collaboration of I think over a dozen now organisations, mainly non-profits, who've come together to create radical transparency in the greenhouse gas emissions debate and making waves. Many of you will have heard one of the well-known patrons of Climate Trace, Al Gore, doing talks on this need for radical transparency across all sectors and across all geographies. So Sumi, on a slide, please. And so key factors here, it's independent, it's very independent, I can vouch for that. It's timely, it's very timely. I think it's probably a year ahead of most other sources of GHG data globally, and the coverage is really excellent. And I think if anything, the kind of timeliness is speeding up over time. So this is a really good place to go for up-to-date, not out-of-date GHG data, and it's covering a lot of the major sectors in the economy in a very user-friendly way. So on to the next slide, please, Sumi. The interesting thing about the Climate Trace proposition is that they are trying to use the power of technology, satellites, artificial intelligence, to power a lot of their GHG inventories, rather than kind of retailing things that come from wholesalers like the International Energy Agency or the EDGAR database. And so here's a really nice animated example of how you can use satellites to detect heat on a steel mill, and then with a kind of clever use of algorithms work out what that heat means for production, because the more heat, the more steel is produced. And so this is like near real time. And I'm guessing that this Eisenhüttenstadt mill must be in Germany or Austria. But if anyone knows differently, please tell me. But you can see here the kind of level of granularity that the Trace team have gone down to just in the steel sector, and they can apply the same sort of approach to cement, shipping, and many other agriculture, many other sectors. Sumi, on again, please. So if you have not seen the map, I really recommend it, and the link is there on the Explore. Please don't start Googling now, because we've still got more to talk about. But the minute we get out of this, I do want to have a look. And the big number there, 58 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2022. That number will, I think, be updated to 2023 towards the end of this year. So this is a really, really good source. But what you won't have seen, if you haven't seen the Climate Trace map, is how these emissions can be broken down and pinpointed pretty precisely in terms of geolocation. And so on this map, you can zoom into your heart's content. And what you'll see here, which I don't think will come as a surprise, is the intensity of some of these emissions in East Asia, in North America, in Europe, and how relatively less emissions there are in Africa, large swathes of Asia, the concentrations of these emissions in Russia, in the energy sector, but not in much else. And you don't quite see Latin America there under the 58 gigatons, but again, a mixed picture. So you can drill down to the most precise location. And just some use cases here for Climate Trace, and I hope I'm doing justice to this. So comparisons between different inventories and gap filling where people have reason to believe that their existing inventory doesn't tell the full picture, and that's quite common actually. Goals setting, standard setting for emissions reductions and scenarios. Use case number 2. Use case number 3, data for subnational and city governments. So this is incredibly useful for jurisdictions to see what assets are in their jurisdiction making emissions from multi-sectors. and then two other final use cases to figure out the difficult scope 3 emissions upstream and downstream, and then finally for evaluation and decision making for financial institutions. And the Trace team, I think, are increasingly, and I would say not just financial institutions, but other businesses and policymakers as well, who are taking a deep interest in their engagement, whether they're facilitating a different sector or financing it or regulating it. So plenty of use cases. Sumi, does that bring us to the end of the Trace slides? It does. Now we've heard from you on the risk factor. So just briefly, what does the joint impact model bring to the party? So the joint impact model probably steps up a bit from the geolocation of Trace and provides some inputs into transition risk in two main areas. One is the supply chain, scope 3, again, that we mentioned. And then the second one is that for the same portfolio, whether it's an investment portfolio or a policy portfolio, we can provide an estimate of the socioeconomic impacts. And that's two things. One is how many jobs is that sector supporting in that country? And then what is the economic value added contribution to the national economy from that sector in that country? So that's very useful contextual information that also fills in gaps. Now, I think we're in good time. The proposal was to dive into the steel sector in Brazil, as I mentioned in the introductory remarks. It's a material sector, 11% of global emissions. It's a material sector in Brazil, although it's a sector that has been underperforming, I would say, in the Brazilian context, with a kind of decline in production from, I think, 34 million tons to about 32 million tons in the last couple of years. But it's a sector that is set to receive between 10 and 20 billion US dollars of investment over the next 5 to 10 years, according to news reports in Bloomberg and other sources, which will see a sort of major investment in the steel sector in Brazil to try and make it more competitive and more efficient. That's necessary because the analysis we're going to share with you now shows that there's very mixed performance in the steel sector when you start to unpack it at a granular level. So who wants to go first on steel in Brazil? And is there anyone in the audience who would consider themselves an expert in this sector that can provide us with additional insights as we go through this case study? I should say we could have chosen any other sector in any other country, and all three of these tools would also provide insight for it. So we could look into cement in Nigeria, or we could look into automotive in Indonesia, or we could take smaller nations and more obscure sectors, and all of these three tools are equally granular with those sectors, but we've chosen steel in Brazil for this purpose. So Gerhard, I'm going to pass the mic back to you to take us through the risk in the sector.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. And yeah, you sound like an expert on climate trace. Congratulations. You passed the test. So
Thank you very
ladies
much.
and gentlemen, so sometimes you hear we don't have enough data. There's not good quality data to make decisions, etc., etc. Let me emphasize that that is not the case. There is a lot of data out there, but what we lack sometimes is wisdom, that we translate and aggregate all this data and then put it in the hands of the right people so they can make better decisions. So in a way, that is what we do. And what I really like about this webinar is that Climate Trace and the Joint Impact Model and us are really working together, and we're borrowing from each other and using each other's data so that we can together put together a better tool in the hands of decision makers. So back to this, to the steel in Brazil case study. What we have done then is uploaded this fairly small portfolio of about 20 assets into our platform and then the platform automatically calculates the physical climate risk as well as transition risk, by the way, but we will focus on physical climate risk only, of all of these assets. Now, the platform itself can manage about 100,000 assets, right? So if you have a big portfolio, for example, of loans, then you can upload that as well. But in this case, we limited our analysis to 20 different assets. Now, the assets are located in Brazil. It's a Brazilian steel manufacturer, but they also have assets in North America, as you can see. Now, here you see the executive summary here. What is very common in physical risk analysis for climate is that we have 4 different periods. We have a baseline period, a short-term, medium-term, and long-term, going out all the way to 2100. And what you would see intuitively is that the risks on aggregate is going up, and that is what you see in this portfolio. So if we go to the next slide, then we dig a little deeper, but what we're really interested in is what the different risk concentrations are, right? So which hazards are contributing, which locations are contributing, which sectors are contributing mostly to the risk in your portfolio. Now, of course, in this case, the sector is clear. That was manufacturing of basic metals. But perhaps, you know, the locations wasn't clear. And you can see immediately that the main risks that is contributing to this portfolio of assets is water stress. And that makes a lot of sense, right? There's a lot of water that goes into steel manufacturing. And if you go to a place like Texas, for example, Georgia, Mexico, those are all areas that are at high risk from water stress. Now, interestingly, in Brazil itself, freshwater is less of a problem. So you don't see assets located in Brazil in this case, but equally that could have, you know, happened anywhere. If we go to the next slide, we can also dig into the asset level. So let's take one of these assets here. In this case, it is the steel plant near Sao Paulo. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the individual risk scores. And this is where I go back to what we have talked about before, which is hazards times sensitivity, right? So here we have 14 different hazards: coastal flood, river flood, heat stress, etc., drought. And they each have a hazard score for that very specific location. But then we also need to think in terms of what is the sensitivity. And you see that, for example, for, now let's say water stress, right? In this case, has a very high sensitivity. It has a sensitivity score of 5. But in this case, the water stress is projected to be fairly low. So that gives us a fairly low overall risk score. Now, if you were to then really start using this information, what you would be interested in is which hazards are contributing most of the risks, and then organize a process in which you start identifying adaptation measures, because you can't help that you will be experiencing heat stress, river flood, etc. But you can prepare for that. You can adapt. So that is also how this information can be used. So what I've shown you now is that we have a portfolio of assets, then you have individual assets. And it's really important that we can combine the two so we can have informed decisions about risk concentration on a portfolio level, as well as identifying individual adaptation measures on the asset level. Thank you very much, and back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Gerhard. So that's a masterclass in risk. Now we now have Bene. She has found her way out of the metro into the room, and so we're going to go and have a look at trace in action in a live context. And Bene, I hope you're kind of all fired up and ready to take us into the steel case.
Absolutely. So we're going to have a look at what can we do with climate trace data on steel. Those are some of the use cases we've gone through with real life companies, but that might also spark ideas for you guys. So I'm going to start with scope 3 and then move on to some different things. So what we looked at is, let's imagine if you're a big car manufacturer and you're purchasing big amount of steels. Steel is very, very emission intensive. Does it change something if you change supplier? In some areas, if you do that, it doesn't really decrease your greenhouse gas emissions. All the suppliers have roughly the same emission intensity. But in steel, there is really very big differences. So we picked some plants. We picked some from Tata Steel. We picked some from ThyssenKrupp, and then we picked some from ArcelorMittal, specifically in Brazil. And we compared their carbon emission intensity. And in this case, so the Brazilian sites of ArcelorMittal came up with an emission intensity lower by 165% compared to the others. So it is an area where now data is very easily accessible. You can very easily have a transparent overview of every supplier in the world. You can rank them, and then up to you to decide if you want to change or not to actually improve your greenhouse gas data. If you move to the next one, to the next slide, still on this scope 3, we ranked all the steel facilities in the world based on emission intensity. Again, to see the difference between all of these plants and the different technologies involved. And the most carbon emission intensive are 5 times higher than the lowest one. So just to say, it's a use case where potentially transparency of data can accelerate the change towards lower carbon emissions. If you can move to the next one. Now, other things that can be done with data is, for instance, when we work with Jim, what Jim will provide, the spin on the carbon data is to look at it from the financed emissions point of view. So you can have a look at the financed emissions for steel, which is a combination of our data and of other data that is available. And 2 other examples are something that Clarity AI has done for oil and gas, but I'm mentioning it because it could be maybe transposed for steel. In oil and gas, they took the top 20 largest companies, and they looked at what a part of scope 3, which is their minority stakeholders. So companies that they own, but that they don't operate, that falls into their scope 3. They don't report emissions for those. So what Clarity AI did with our data is that they did the carbon footprint of those so-called missing emissions, or scope 3 emissions, and then did the global carbon footprint of those top 20 oil and gas companies. And the carbon footprint, once it includes those hidden emissions, actually increased by 24%, so almost a quarter. So data is available for you to actually recompose the carbon footprint of large emitters, and you can choose a bit the scope that you want to have, because there's enough granularity for you to build up, to have all the building blocks. And the last one is a regulatory opportunity in Europe, the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And so what our data allows you to do is look at, for instance, the steel emissions of certain assets. So let's say in countries where you don't have to report, so that you wouldn't have the data available, but it is available through Climate Trace, and you can see the exposure that they would have in Europe. So when they import it, and what sort of tax they would have to pay. So there's a couple of different ways of looking at how our data can help you on the steel in Brazil and in elsewhere. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Benny, and Gerhard. Like, super interesting. And I just want to check. So, would you describe yourself, either of you, as a deep expert on the steel sector in Brazil, to share that kind of quite intense amount of knowledge that you just showed? Is that have you both got a PhD in the Brazil steel sector, or?
Personally, not at all, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point, is to make data very easily accessible. And you probably presented on my behalf, but the map of Climate Trace, you just like climatetrace.org/explore, you have that map. You can just type in ArcelorMittal, Gazprom, whatever, and you will see the different big sites in the world with all the information. And you can very quickly build your ranking or your portfolio. And it's a kid's game basically.
Yeah.
Nowadays, with the technology that we have and that we've harnessed.
Great, because the kids need it. Gerhard, Dan's asking how much data you need to populate the risk assessment. Is it kind of like vast amounts of corporate data that you need on the steel sector to even get your machine to work and generate those risk assessments?
No, what we need is the latitude, longitude of the asset and its economic activity. Now, if it is a bit of a standard economic activity like steel manufacturing, then we have done some serious research, although I personally do not have that PhD in steel manufacturing, neither does one of my colleagues, but we do know which are the right questions to ask to understand what the individual sensitivities are of steel manufacturing to a particular hazard, right? So it is, for example, steel manufacturing, it is well known that it uses a lot of water, for example. Well, then there's a high sensitivity to water stress, right? So, and we have documented this all, and in the spirit of radical transparency, which is perhaps one of my favorite words, Alex, our
That's Al Gore's phrase, not mine, but I'll take it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Al. But now I've lost my train of thought. That the whole methodology and all the assumptions and all the sources, etc., is fully transparent, right? So you can go and basically, get all the information. But when it comes to radical transparency, I can't emphasize enough what a leapfrog change climate trace is. So, for example, next week, I will be spending most of my weeks with some bankers in Egypt, with one of the leading banks there. They have no idea where the assets are located of their clients. But now what they can do is they can go to Climate Trace, they can type in the name of the client, and then you will find the exact lat long of that particular asset of that client. That is, and that's all for free, right? So I can't tell you how big of a difference this can make, but now we need to work together. It's not just, the three organizations on this team, but everybody in this webinar working together to make sure that we can push this data into the hands of the right decision makers in emerging markets, in developing economies, as well as the developed economies. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now to fill in the last piece on this jigsaw, but I'm just also going to pick up Joy Dubois' question about the well-known case, I think, sadly, where after kind of 5 or 10 years of task forces on disclosure, first on climate, then nature, and today on inequality launching, the truth is that a lot of companies haven't disclosed fully on these important parameters, and of the companies that have disclosed, it's pretty hard to work out the completeness and timeliness of their disclosures. And so Rebecca's going to show us, I think, where the GIM can fill in the gaps to work out whether a company is being kind of fulsome in its disclosure, particularly on scope 3, what the job profile looks like that is very seldom reported, and where a company hasn't disclosed at all on emissions, what you can do with other company disclosures which are regulated and which are in the public domain. So Rebecca, take it away. And Gerhard, please have a look in the Q&A as well as the chat, because there's a couple of questions for you on provenance of the hazard data, I think, on the risk tool. Rebecca,
Okay.
over to you.
Yes, so like Alex said, my name is Rebecca, and I'm the stakeholder manager at the GIM. So before we get into our portion of the case study analysis, I want to provide a brief overview of the GIM and what it does, because I think not everyone here is super familiar with the model. So the GIM is a web-based tool. It's input-output model. It relies on IO modeling to provide institutions with estimated impacts of their investments. So the GIM provides an estimate of these 3 impacts: GHG emissions, which is the sum of CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. We break that down to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 upstream. And then the second impact that we estimate is job supported, which the GIM defines as all working people who are engaged in activities to produce goods or provide services for pay. We also divide this down into direct, supply chain, and induced, formal and informal, and then we further break that down into men and women. Then finally, the GIM provides an estimate of value added to local economies. It does that by summing salaries, taxes, and savings, and we, of course, break that down into salaries, taxes, and savings. So now, next slide, we will look at a little bit closer into the steel sector in Brazil. So what we did here was we looked at publicly available data from the Central Bank of Brazil. And we looked at the amount of dollars that had been invested into a wide range of sectors, and we specifically deciphered the total exposure to the steel sector, which we took to be around 15 billion US dollars. So we ran this number into the GIM using GIM's asset-based emission factors, and the GIM gave us this information. So financed emissions per scope and impact on jobs. Again, what Alex and Bene were saying here, scope 3 supply chain, super interesting because you can see that around 40% of total emissions are in that upstream scope 3 range. Also interesting to note is that over exactly 53% of supply chain jobs are located in that they're located in that supply chain for jobs supported. So this shows the importance of looking at all the supply chain impacts. And now we can move on to the next slide, where we took a deeper look into the steel sector of Brazil. So we wanted to do this to provide a little bit of a more granular analysis of the steel sector in Brazil. So we wanted to look at the different impacts of that sector. So we took the top 3 steel companies by revenue, so the top earning revenue steel companies, and we summed that amount, so around 40 billion US dollars, and we input that into the GIM. So again, this is the output that the GIM gave us. We see still around that 40% of those emissions are in upstream scope 3, with again, just over half of those jobs supported being in supply chain. Another interesting thing I wanted to point out here is that we see in the supply chain, 1 in 4 of these supply chain jobs are actually undertaken by women. So this is another way that the GIM provides another layer of granularity to your analysis and allows you to look at how are you tracking towards the just transition, because not only does it focus on those carbon emissions, but it also shows you the amount of jobs that are going to be impacted by these transitions. Thank you.
And Rebecca and Sumiran, the same question to you. How's your kind of PhD in Brazilian steel? What was it like finding the input data to run this analysis?
I think after this week, we might be well on our way, actually. So maybe we'll apply for a PhD in steel.
Thank you, Rebecca, Bene, Gerhard, for taking us into a kind of live case there. I hope those of you in kind of attending will be kind of interested in these analyses, and I'd love to spend the last 15 minutes brainstorming with you on a sort of data jam about what we could do with these overlapping sources of data. So Gerhard has already set that up a bit. Ben has already set it up. Somebody has got their mic on and they're in a busy room. I think it might be Juan Carlos. I'm going to ask you to go on mute. I beg your pardon. So I'd like to kind of explore that. I think the kind of key message here is that this kind of data revolution should be empowering for businesses, assets, policymakers, NGOs, campaigners, analysts, because it should massively reduce the frustration of not being able to pursue a line of inquiry because there's missing data. So data at all different quality levels is now available to fill in gaps and allow you to move on to something more action oriented than benchmarking and footprinting. And I do feel, and I know that fellow panelists probably join me in this, that we've spent probably 5 years in a kind of holding pattern, waiting for better data. And that's caused frustrations up to the kind of level of Mike Bloomberg and President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who set up the net zero data public utility precisely because of frustrations that companies were being too slow filling in gaps. Companies themselves have all sorts of problems, but they're also not making use of the available tools to fast track solutions. They're being maybe too perfectionist. And in the worst case, maybe they're hiding behind perfection to be untransparent. And there are certainly examples of that going on in various sectors. So the message is, don't bring out those excuses and make use of the tools, fill in the gaps. If you don't fill in the gaps, then anyone who doesn't even know that much about your sector and your country will fill in the gaps for you anyway. So you might as well provide that data yourself and make sure it's as accurate as possible. But if you don't do that for any reason, people are going to move ahead. There's no time to wait for the missing data, the play that we've been hearing so much of in the last 5 years. So it's a kind of empowering, but also, fairly firm message that we need to advance into climate action. Now, Bene, Gerhard, what are your thoughts about what more we could do and we're not saying we're the only 3 tools out there, of course, there are plenty of other players here, but what can we be doing together? Who's got a thought there? Or Rebecca, you as well?
Bene, do you want to go first, or?
Happy for you to go first. I can follow.
Right on. So, there's an incredible information asymmetry in a way, right? So there's all this information, but what is the plumbing, if you like, to, what are the information networks to make sure that this information now gets into the hands of people who are making decisions? The information is there, but now what are we going to do in order to make sure that that banker in Cairo can make a better decision when he speaks with a steel company or an oil and gas company in Egypt and start identifying, what adaptation measures they should take, or a bank in, let's say, in Mexico, or another user in Mexico who will be engaging with an agricultural company and say, okay, there's real water risk here. How can we start engaging with this? And that is not a technical problem necessarily. That really is almost like we're running up some rather irrational barriers, if you like, and it almost requires a change of belief, a change of values in terms of pushing this message forward as hard as we can, because there's still too many people out there who believe that climate change is a future problem, or that it will go away by itself by some hoodies in Silicon Valley. That is not going to happen. We need an all of the above approach where we pull out all stops. And as you rightfully say, Alex, time's up, right? We have to do it. It's our generation that needs to do it. We have until the end of this decade, to start bending the curve. And otherwise, we're starting to trigger, some tipping points, and we will basically enter unknown territory. So that is my main, I would say, my main answer to that. Don't think that this is just because we now have better data that people start making better decisions. It also requires a change of beliefs and values. So people actually will start using this data and overcoming their irrational barriers.
That's fantastic, Benny. While you're collecting your thoughts, I've lost my bet. I'm 5,000 reais worse off because we've got Nathan de Bertoli in Brazil, and he is laying down a challenge about the granularity of the risk, the hazard data that we've got, Gerhard and Pekka. So Pekka, I know you're kind of you're good on this. I mean, Nathan, tell us a little bit. You can unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about where we can get hold of better Brazil data, because I know that Gerhard's team are always hungry to kind of see what they can feed into the model to give, you know, more action-oriented and more reliable data. But let's hear from you if you want to share. If not, let's set up a side meeting after this while Benny kind of shares some thoughts about kind of next stages in collaboration.
Hi, yes, nice meeting you guys, and wonderful work. I think the idea of the tool is amazing. And I have dealt with similar problems in the past concerning data for different countries that I'm analyzing. I'm actually from Brazil, and I know the gaps that we have here. But recently, I have the chance to do a work using software from the University of Stanford called Invest to map ecosystem services. And in this software, we were required to gather a lot of different data. And some of the data sets that you guys mentioned here, I have used to map different types of ecosystem services in Brazil, which include data related to climate, but also specific data on erosion and other variables. And some of these global data sets that you used, we tried to use and we compared to the local data that we had in Brazil. And there was a big difference in terms of erosion and other specific ecosystem services and, hydrology information. So I would just say that you can use the tool, but make sure that you go and compare with the local data from the country you're looking at to make sure that the data is well suited and has been calibrated to the landscape and the ecosystem that you're looking at, because you might do some sort of generalization. And at the end, you might provide, to a government or someone, something that is not completely 100% sure. I'm just sharing this, and if you're interested, I could provide some of more reliable data for Brazil in terms of the risk factors. Thank you.
Beleza, that's fantastic, Nathan. Thank you. And look, we know this in every case. If you have a global model, there's, what I call it the kind of pineapple factor from some work I was doing in Ecuador last year, where the bank said, hey, but have you got emission factors for pineapple? And we're going like, no, we don't. We just have kind of general citrus fruits. But so there's always gap filling, and kind of there's always a case that's more granular than what the model can provide. The good thing is that kind of extra fields these days don't cost much. So if the data's there, is really not difficult, so long as the kind of, and the one thing that we do have in the world is plenty of coders. So like coding isn't a constraint, and if the data's there, it in principle it can be fed in both to the trace tool, the CRS tool, and to the GIM. So we all see this as a big collaboration. I think the message though is which I hope you'd agree with, is that kind of it's better to get started than to wait for the perfect thing if it's going to take too long. That kind of already with kind of good enough data, you can begin to see the actions that are required. And given how long it takes for businesses to actually implement a climate plan, we don't want them to wait for 5 years to kind of get to the starting point. Pekka, welcome back. So who else? I'm just seeing kind of Minor. I know you're based in Central America. It's great to hear from you. So I'm sure there's kind of factors in Central America we'll want to be taken into account. We've got 5 minutes left. The time always goes super fast. I'd love to hear from anyone else in the room if they've got suggestions, questions, if they want follow-ups. And then I'm going to ask Gerhard, Bene, and Rebecca to kind of give me some closing thoughts, which I think I can do all of that in 5 minutes. So any last suggestions in the Q&A or the chat? We've got some people to follow up with. Laurence, your question about the the data that's required. Rebecca, maybe you could quickly tackle that while Bene and Gerhard are collecting their final thoughts. Actually, the question is about the risk platform, but the nice thing is that the same data works on emissions, risk, and jobs,
Yes.
and also kind of follows through into the kind of physical emissions database at Climate Trace. So it's universal data, really.
Yeah, so for the GIM, it's revenue, classification of investments, and then location.
Great. So Lawrence, I hope that answers your question. Now Bene, any sort of closing thoughts in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really about seeing through this case study that we pulled together that there is a lot of information available. If you want to know about emissions in tons of CO2 or scope 1, you have it with Climate Trace. If you want to have a look at it from a risk point of view, you have it pre-packaged off the shelf with a platform like Climate Risk Services. If you want to see more a scope 3 angle, you want to see the jobs, you also have it. So it's very rich. And for me, it's a bit like Gerhard, is what do users need next to actually make action happen? And that's what I would be very interested, anyone who wants to reach to any one of us, actually, and we can have a conversation. What is needed next? Is it that the data needs to be even easier packaged in insights? Is it that we can look at different sectors in oil and gas? Is it something more to do in methane? Is it something more to do with cities, because maybe there's a big untapped potential? There's just lots of different possibilities to create action, and what is missing for you guys to do something about it. And then I think the three of us here, we're more than receptive to think about how do we put that onto our roadmap. Is it to be a one-stop shop, as someone is saying? Is there a plan to bundle this all in GIM? I know how being very extensive is really important for the financial sector.
It's hopefully not a shop, but a kind of some other type of entity. But yeah, I mean, thanks, Hemen. That's a good suggestion. Some things can be bundled. Some things are best kind of sitting beside. It's great to hear that you're already engaged with the CRS team. Gerhard, your kind of closing thoughts?
Yeah, my closing thoughts is, well, first of all, that bundling is already happening, right? I mean, the joint impact model already has a climate risk module right now. It is already using Climate Trace data. So I think there is a bit of convergence there. But I really would like also, to second Bene's point. And I'd like to challenge, the users of data to really think about, okay, what information do you really need in order to make better decision? And I have been in situations, and this is also an earlier point about the local data quality, where I was sitting in a room full of risk managers, where the chief risk officer of a leading bank here in the Netherlands was humming and hawing about integrating climate risk into his loan pricing frameworks for mortgages. Now, there is no place in the world where there's a higher data quality infrastructure than in the Netherlands. We model, this up to the square meter. You can go to websites here in the Netherlands where you can see what the flood risk is on the square meter. And yet he wasn't going to use that data. And why wasn't he going to use the data? Is because he was just mentally blocked, to actually take that big decision to start integrating climate risk into his loan pricing frameworks. And why would that be the case? Well, for him, basically, climate change is still not a conventional topic for him. It is still not commonly accepted that climate change poses a financial risk. And there's too many people out there who still believe that climate change is a future problem. Well, it is not. And I think we should start rethinking some of those assumptions. So better data, more granular data, etc., does not necessarily lead to better decisions, but a change in attitude and beliefs and values will.
Thank you, Gerhard. That's fantastic. So thank you, Gerhard, Bene, Rebecca, and most of all, thank you to all of the participants and the team behind the analysis in the organizations, all the suggestions. I hope you have a great day. Sorry to keep you one New York minute beyond our closing time. I hope you have a great rest of the session, a really productive week. Please do get in touch with us if you want to dig in deeper. We will share the recording for those of you who came in late, and you can share it with your colleagues as well. Please do put on your thinking hat and think about innovations and your data dream and your visibility dream. And between us, maybe we can come up with some ideas of how to kind of help you realize that dream. So thank you all very much, and wishing you a successful New York Climate Week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.